The message came across the stars like a cry for help. The kingdoms far away were breaking under endless war. They asked Earth for soldiers, men to fight in their ranks and hold the line. The leaders of Earth read the request and gave their answer in silence. They did not send ordinary soldiers. They sent enforcers. John sat in the dark cabin of the carrier ship. His hands were scarred and his eyes were steady. He had seen many battles before and had walked away from each one, leaving nothing but ruin behind. Across from him sat Claire. Her mind worked like a blade. She was not only a fighter, but a thinker who could read an enemy before they even moved. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. They had been chosen because they were not made to follow orders blindly. They were made to end wars. When the carrier ship touched down in the foreign land, the air was heavy with smoke. Fields burned in the distance. Men in broken armor fled past the gates of a great city. On high walls, banners of a queen hung torn and stained. The queen herself came out to greet them. She looked at the enforcers with sharp eyes. She had asked for soldiers, not these strangers with silent stares and weapons she did not know. She held her doubts inside, but her court whispered them out loud. They said Earth had sent killers, not defenders. The enforcers did not bow. John stood still as stone. Claire's gaze swept across the queen's men, weighing them like pieces on a board. When the queen asked them to swear loyalty, John only said one line. He said they had not come to serve. They had come to win. The court murmured in anger, but the queen did not send them away. She had no choice. Her kingdom was close to breaking. The first test came faster than expected. Riders brought word that a siege line had formed outside the city. An enemy host had been hammering the walls for months, and the queen's army had failed to break them. John listened in silence, then took up his weapon. Claire studied a rough map and gave sharp commands. Within an hour, the enforcers were moving out. When they reached the siege line, the enemy laughed at the small number that came against them. But laughter turned to fear when John walked into their ranks without hesitation. He struck with the speed of a storm. Steel rang and men fell. No shield could hold. No line could stay firm. Claire directed the moves with calm words, guiding the enforcers like hunters through prey. By nightfall, the siege line was broken. The city gates were safe again. The queen stood on her walls and saw what had been done. She had asked for soldiers, but she now understood what Earth had sent. These were not soldiers. These were men and women who did not fight for defense. They fought to crush. The court was silent now, their whispers choked by the fear of what they had seen. John and Claire returned without celebration. They did not wait for thanks. They did not care for cheers. They came for one reason only. They came because Earth had decided that this war would not be fought by weak men. It would be ended by enforcers. The city was still breathing in fear when dawn came. The smoke of the broken siege fires drifted over the walls. Farmers, soldiers, and common folk watched from the streets as the enforcers marched back inside. They walked with steady steps, not with pride but with purpose. John and Claire led them, their eyes set forward, not seeking the gaze of those who whispered. The queen met them in her hall. Gold banners hung from high beams, but they looked pale against the dark steel of the enforcers. She rose from her throne and spoke of their victory. She said the people were safe because of them. Her court clapped their hands in weak praise, but there was no warmth in their voices. They feared what they had seen, and fear was stronger than gratitude. John stood silent while Claire stepped forward. She asked for full reports of enemy numbers, of supply lines, and of the rival lords who backed the siege. The queen's generals hesitated, unused to sharing power with strangers. One of them spoke with anger, saying outsiders had no right to command in the queen's hall. Claire looked at him with calm eyes and asked him how many battles he had won in the last year. He had no answer. The hall fell silent. The queen, seeing the truth in Claire's words, ordered her generals to obey. She did not like the loss of control, but she could not risk another defeat. The rival lords were gathering strength and the siege had only been the first blow. Reports spoke of more armies marching, driven by greed for the throne. John led the enforcers into the outer districts of the city. He walked among the broken houses and torn fields. He spoke with no one, but the people watched him with wide eyes. They saw in him a man who carried no fear, a man who walked as if the world was his to take. Children followed at a distance, silent, as if they sensed that his presence meant both danger and safety. Claire remained in the war hall. She spread maps across the long table and placed markers with steady hands. She studied the terrain, the rivers, the hills, and the roads. Every line told a story of weakness and strength. She saw where the enemy would come next. She saw where they would bleed. She gave orders with clarity, and the Queen's men obeyed without question, though many of them ground their teeth as they did so. That night, word came of another host moving fast. It was larger than the siege force, with banners from 3 rival lords. They were marching straight toward the Queen's lands. Panic moved through the city, but John only sharpened his blade. He gathered the enforcers and told them they would meet the enemy on open ground. He said they would not hide behind walls like cowards. They would strike first. When the enforcers moved out, the Queen's court argued against it. They said the numbers were too great, that no small band could face such a host. But the Queen gave no command to stop them. In her heart, she feared the enforcers, yet she also feared losing her throne more. She let them go. The march through the night was silent. John led at the front, his shadow long in the moonlight. Claire rode beside him, her mind sharp with thought. She knew this battle would not just test their strength. It would show the world what Earth had truly sent. Soldiers followed armies, enforcers erased them, and by dawn, the rival lords would learn the difference. The rival lords came with banners high and drums pounding. Their armies stretched across the fields like a tide of steel and fire. They believed numbers would crush the enforcers, that sheer weight of men would drown them. But John and Claire stood at the front of their line without fear. Behind them, the enforcers waited, silent, their weapons ready. The morning sun cut through the mist as the first charge began. Thousands of men rushed forward with shouts that shook the ground. John stepped out alone. He met the first wave head-on, his blade tearing through shields and spears. The sound of steel clashing echoed across the field. Every strike he made sent fear through the enemy ranks. They saw a man who fought like death itself, and doubt spread among them. Claire did not rush into the fight. She stayed back, her eyes scanning every move. She called orders sharp and clear, guiding the enforcers into perfect strikes. They moved like hunters, cutting into weak spots, breaking the enemy's rhythm. Small groups of enforcers tore holes through the larger army, leaving trails of broken men. Claire's voice carried over the field, steady and sure, and her fighters followed without hesitation. The rival lords watched from a hill. They had thought the enforcers would fall within minutes, but their soldiers broke instead. Men fled from John's path, leaving gaps that widened into chaos. Claire saw it and sent her fighters deeper. She ordered them to strike the heart of the enemy host. One by one, enemy captains fell, their banners trampled into the mud. John's blade never slowed. He cut down man after man, his steps steady, his strikes brutal. Fear spread faster than fire. Whole lines of soldiers turned and ran, pushing against their own men to escape. What had begun as a great charge turned into a wave of panic. The rival lords shouted for control, but their voices could not reach the broken hearts of their men. Claire gave one final order. She told the enforcers to drive straight through the center. With ruthless force, they split the enemy host in two. John led the push, his blade clearing the way. The field filled with screams and the crash of broken lines. When the sun climbed higher, the armies of the rival lords were no longer an army. They were scattered men running for their lives. By midday, the field was quiet. Bodies lay across the grass, banners torn and trampled. John stood covered in dust and blood, his chest rising steady as if the fight had been nothing more than duty. Claire walked among the fallen, her eyes cold and sharp. She gave no word of victory, only commands to regroup. The enforcers obeyed, their discipline unshaken. From the walls of the city, the Queen's soldiers watched in awe. They had feared the enforcers, but now they saw them as something beyond human. Whispers spread quickly, saying Earth had sent not men but executioners of war. The Queen herself remained silent, her thoughts hidden, yet she knew her throne had been saved not by her armies, but by strangers who had no loyalty to her crown. When John and Claire returned to the city, no cheer rose to meet them. The people only watched in silence, afraid to speak, afraid to draw the gaze of the enforcers. In their hearts they felt both relief and fear. Relief that the rival lords had been crushed, fear of the power that now walked their streets. John said nothing as he passed through the gates. Claire only spoke one line to the queen when they entered the hall. She said this was not the end. More would come. When they did, the enforcers would be ready. The city rested under an easy silence after the great battle. Smoke from the burning fields still drifted across the horizon. The people did not sing or shout for victory. They looked to the streets where the enforcers walked, their faces hard, their weapons never far from hand. The people had been saved, but they did not feel safe. They whispered that the enforcers were more dangerous than the lords they had defeated. I guess. In the Queen's Hall, tension grew thicker each day. Her generals bowed to her in name, but their eyes were drawn to John and Claire. The enforcers had done what no army of the kingdom could. It crushed thousands with only a fraction of their number. Fear and envy poisoned the court. Some of the Queen's lords spoke in secret, saying the throne itself now belonged to Earth. The Queen tried to keep her hold. She summoned John and Claire, demanding to know their plans. John answered with silence, his gaze steady and unshaken. Claire spoke instead. She told the Queen that more enemies would rise. She said fear was spreading through the rival lands, but fear often led to desperate alliances. The Queen clenched her hands, uneasy at the cold certainty in Claire's voice. That night, rumors raced through the city. Riders had seen fires on the borders. Scouts brought word of fresh armies gathering, not only from rival lords but from desperate men who sought revenge for the slaughter. The threat was larger than before, an ocean of steel ready to march against the Queen's throne. The people trembled, and the Queen's court grew restless. John gathered the enforcers outside the walls. He spoke few words, but every fighter listened. He told them they were not here to defend walls or crowns. They were here to break armies, to end wars. The enforcers nodded without question. Their loyalty was not to the Queen, it was to Earth and to each other. Claire sharpened her strategy in the war hall. She studied the new reports marking rivers, hills, and valleys where the enemy might move. She placed tokens on weak points and spoke of how the enemy's fear could be turned against them. Her words cut through the doubts of the Queen's generals.
Even those who hated her could not deny her mind was sharper than their blades. The Queen stood at the edge of the table, her crown heavy on her head. She tried to command respect, but the eyes of her own men shifted to Claire with every word. Anger burned in her chest, but she swallowed it.
She could not afford to lose the strength of the enforcers, not while her throne was under threat. When word came that the enemy host was on the march, the enforcers moved without delay. They left the city before dawn, their steps silent, their formation tight. John walked at the front with his blade across his back. Claire rode beside him, her mind turning the land into a weapon. The city watched them go with dread and awe, knowing they carried the fate of the kingdom in their hands. As the sun rose higher, scouts brought more news. The enemy host was vast, greater than any force the Queen had faced before. They carried banners of vengeance and marched with the fury of men who had lost everything. But John did not slow his pace. Claire did not change her orders. The enforcers pressed forward, ready to strike fear once more. The Queen stood on her tower and watched them disappear beyond the hills. Her court stood behind her in silence. Some prayed for victory. Some prayed for the enforcers to fall and never return. In her heart, the Queen felt both hopes. She needed them to win, but she feared what their victory might mean for her throne. The march to meet the enemy host was long and cold. The enforcers moved through valleys and across rivers without rest. They carried no banners and sang no songs. Their silence was heavier than the steel on their backs. John led at the front, his steps steady, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Claire rode beside him, her hand always on the maps she had marked through the night. Scouts returned with grim reports. The enemy host was vast, greater than anything the enforcers had yet faced. It was said the rival lords had joined with mercenaries and broken men, bound together by revenge. They carried banners of blood and swore oaths of vengeance. They marched with fire in their hearts, but Claire knew fire could be turned against itself. At dawn, the two forces met in a wide plain cut by a river. The enemy stretched from hill to hill, their numbers darkening the land. They shouted war cries that shook the ground. As an answer, the enforcers stood silent, their lines small against the tide, but unshaken. John raised his blade once and lowered it. At! That was the only signal they needed. The enemy charged with thunderous force. The lines of spearmen and swordsmen rushed across the plain. Arrows darkened the sky. John surged forward, his strike splitting the first wave in two. He fought without pause, each blow cutting down men who thought they could overwhelm him with numbers. His strength carried through the field like a storm. Claire gave sharp commands from a rise at the center. She moved her fighters into tight formations, striking weak points the enemy never thought they had. Every time a gap opened, the enforcers drove into it with brutal precision. They cut the enemy apart piece by piece, breaking their strength as if they were nothing but branches snapped underfoot. The battle raged for hours. The enemy threw wave after wave, but each time they met John at the front, his blade carved through armor and bone. Fear spread with each step he took. Men began to falter, their war cries breaking into screams. Behind him, the enforcers fought with ruthless discipline. They wasted no movement, no breath. They struck only to kill. Claire's eyes stayed sharp. She saw the enemy's captains pushing from behind, trying to drive their men forward. She pointed to them and gave the order. The enforcers cut through the chaos, reaching the captains and cutting them down one by one. With every banner that fell, the enemy's heart grew weaker. By midday, the field was soaked in blood. The river ran red as broken bodies filled its banks. John stood unyielding at the center, his chest rising steady, his hands never slowing. Claire gave one final command, and the enforcers drove through the last of the resistance. What began as a massive host was now shattered into fleeing survivors. The plain that had once echoed with war cries now lay in silence, broken only by the moans of the dying. When the fighting was done, John cleaned his blade with slow, steady hands. Claire walked the field, her boots dark with mud and blood. She gave orders to regroup, her voice as calm as it had been at the start. The enforcers obeyed without question. Far away on the hills, the Queen's riders had watched. They carried the news back to the city with wide eyes. They spoke of a battle where thousands had fallen, yet the enforcers stood like an iron wall that could not break. In the city, the people whispered again, saying Earth had not sent soldiers. Earth had sent something far worse. That night, around their small campfires, the enforcers spoke little. John sat apart, his gaze on the stars. Claire looked over her maps once more. They both knew the war was not over. They had broken the enemy. But power always shifts, and another threat would rise. For enforcers, there was never peace. There was only the next battle. The news of the victory spread across the land faster than the wind. The rival lords who still lived pulled back in fear. Their men whispered of the enforcers. Of John, who fought like a storm, and of Claire, who saw through every plan before it was made. The Queen's city grew quiet, caught between relief and unease. Her throne still stood, but everyone knew it was because of the enforcers, not because of her. Inside her hall, the Queen called John and Claire before her. Her crown glittered in the firelight, but her voice carried anger. She said the people were beginning to bow to the enforcers, more than to her crown. She said they had saved her throne, but were also stealing it with every battle they won. Her words cut through the chamber, and the court watched in silence, waiting for the answer. John did not bow. He stood as solid as stone, his eyes unflinching. He told her that Earth had not sent soldiers to kneel before her. Earth had sent enforcers to end wars, and they would do so whether she liked it or not. The Queen's hands tightened around her throne. The air in the hall grew heavy, but she did not strike them down. She could not. She knew her armies were nothing without them. Claire stepped forward with calm words, though her tone was sharp. She told the Queen that the rival lords were broken, but not destroyed. She said new threats would come, and if the Queen wanted to keep her throne, she would need the enforcers. But Claire also warned her. She said Earth did not give its strength for free. There would be a price, and one day the Queen would learn what it was. That night, the Queen walked the halls alone. Her court whispered behind her, saying she had lost control, saying her throne was now guarded by strangers who might one day claim it. In her heart, she burned with anger and fear. She hated the enforcers, yet she knew she could not stand without them. Meanwhile, John led the enforcers through the city's outer walls. He saw the people watching from their doorways. Some looked with awe, others with dread. Children stared with wide eyes, unsure if they were looking at protectors or executioners. John spoke to no one. His silence was heavier than words. People felt it in their bones. Claire met with the commanders of the Queen's army. She spread her maps and showed them how the rival lords might regroup, how broken men might gather into new forces. The commanders listened, but their pride bled through. They resented taking orders from her, yet they could not deny the truth in her plans. Without her mind, they would already be ash beneath the boots of their enemies. Days passed, and the Queen tried to reclaim her power. She gave speeches to her people, but they looked past her to the enforcers. She rewarded her generals with gold, but they whispered of John and Claire instead. Every attempt to show strength only made her weakness more clear. Her throne still stood, but the shadow of earth loomed over it. One evening, word came of unrest in the distant lands. Broken men were gathering again, calling themselves avengers of the fallen. They swore to tear down the Queen and kill the enforcers who had shamed them. The threat was smaller than before, but it was growing fast. The Queen's council urged her to send her armies, but she looked at John and Claire knowing they would act whether she commanded it or not. John said only one line. He said the war was not yet finished. Claire agreed, her eyes cold and sharp. The enforcers began to prepare once more. The Queen watched in silence, her heart torn between hate and need. She had called for soldiers, but Earth had sent something far beyond her control. The call for vengeance rose like fire across the land. Men who had lost fathers and brothers gathered under new banners. They swore that they would crush the Queen and cut down the enforcers who had shamed them. Their numbers grew until they were a force greater than any single lord had raised before. The Queen's court shook with fear. Her throne trembled once more. The Queen called her council and demanded answers. Her generals spoke of raising walls and gathering soldiers, but none of them believed it would be enough. All eyes turned to John and Claire. They stood apart from the court, their faces steady. John said they would not wait behind stone. He said the enforcers would strike before the enemy reached the gates. Claire laid out her plan, showing where the enemy would move and where they would die. The Queen had no choice but to let them go. The march was hard and long. Enforcers moved through broken lands, past villages burned in the name of revenge. The people watched them pass in silence, some with hope, others with hate. John carried his weapon across his back, his steps heavy but sure. Claire rode beside him, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the new host gathered. When the two forces finally met, the plain shook with the sound of war drums. The enemy filled the field, a sea of men shouting for blood. They believed numbers would break the enforcers at last. John raised his blade, and the enforcers formed their line. There was no fear in their eyes. They had come not to survive, but to destroy. The first clash thundered across the field. Enemies surged like a wave, but John met them head-on. His strikes were brutal, his steps cutting deep into their ranks. Every man who faced him fell. Claire stood higher on a ridge, her voice sharp as she drove the enforcers into deadly precision. They struck weak points, broke lines, and turned the enemy's strength into weakness. The battle raged without pause. The enemy fought with rage, but rage burned out quickly under the cold discipline of the enforcers. John's path cut straight through the center, splitting the host apart. Claire gave orders that turned panic into collapse. Captains fell, banners dropped, and the once mighty host crumbled into fleeing mobs. By nightfall, the field was quiet. Fires burned among the dead. The enforcers stood, bloodied, but unbroken. John cleaned his blade with slow care, his face unreadable. Claire walked among her fighters, giving short commands, her voice steady. The war was finished. The enemy had been destroyed beyond repair. Back in the city, the Queen received the news with both joy and dread. Her throne was safe, but it was clear to all that it stood only because of Earth's enforcers. The people no longer saw her as the savior of the land. They spoke instead of John and Claire, of men and women who fought without mercy and never bowed to crowns. The Queen confronted them once more in her hall. She said they had saved her, but they had also stolen her power. She said she feared what they would do next. John looked at her and told her the truth. Said Earth never sent soldiers to serve kings or queens. Earth sent enforcers to end wars. Claire added that the war was over for now, but the mark of Earth would remain on this land forever. The queen could not answer. Her silence was heavy, her crown feeling weaker than ever. The court bowed their heads, not to her, but to the enforcers standing before her throne. The story of Earth had been written in blood across the kingdom. They had asked for soldiers. Earth had sent enforcers. The world would never forget it.